Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 1 of the Story of Valor podcast. Today with me is Tendai Musikavanhu, CEO of OneStone Capital. Tendai, welcome to the podcast. It's really a real pleasure to have you here with us.
Great being here. Thank you for inviting me.
So I want to kick off with your company and share with us a little bit about the mission and the vision behind your company, OneStone Capital, and what you're doing.
So we started off way back when in the year 2000. We're an asset management business. We also have some private equity and investment banking that we do. We started off in the year 2000 where we focused on indexation, or what's called passive asset management. And all that is, very simply, is that we take people's pension funds, 401ks, and even their mutual fund money and invest it in listed securities. So typically in equities, bonds, money market instruments, and our whole aim is to do it as cost effectively as possible. That's the difference in passive and active. A lot of people would say that you'd count us in the same breath as Vanguard and State Street and BlackRock, although not quite as big yet. But that's basically our style of asset management.
That's awesome. And naturally that leads to a challenge, right, that many businesses and people struggle with, which is it's a trust-based business. You're essentially going out and you're asking people to trust you with their money, that you're going to invest it in a responsible way, that you're going to manage it in a responsible way. So I'd love to hear from you. How did you go about, when you were starting the company, earn the trust of your customers?
Yeah, we started off, with really focusing on our core values. We've read a number of books written by some academics. For example, Built to Last by Professor Jim Collins and Professor Jim Porras. Good to Great is another one, where again the whole point is to have a mission, to have a vision, to have core values. And so we looked to people who had gone before us, people who like the late John Bogle, who came out and in 1975 really called out the asset management or the investment banking industry, basically Wall Street, called out Wall Street for the fact that we weren't really interested in looking after people's money as much as we were making money for ourselves. And so he came up with this whole style of investment that focused really more on the efficiency of cutting costs that were unnecessary, that focused on making sure that we were able to give sustainable good performance and growth to the asset management, also to the pension fund and the investing community. And we basically took the baton from people like that. I remember the first time I ever went to John Bogle's offices in Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. It was my first trip ever to the United States from South Africa. And I was with my colleague, and we told him, hey, you've got some groupies in Africa. You've got people who actually share the same philosophy of looking after people's money, knowing that this is their pension money. This is precious to some people. And making sure that we invest it as wisely as possible, and at the same time sticking to the philosophy of looking after the client's best interest.
Yeah, that's excellent. How did you go about putting the values in practice as you were putting the company together? Because I know a lot of businesses and entrepreneurs, they have a vision of what they want to see happen, and oftentimes it has to do with changing the world. It has to do with helping people. It's idealistic, and that's okay. That's not a bad thing. But how do you actually live that out in a practical way?
I think as an entrepreneur and as, I suppose, eventually a business leader, everybody's watching, right? Your customers are watching, your staff are watching, your fellow leaders in the business are watching to see if you really live out those values. Because there was a lot of cynicism, and there still is a lot of cynicism around values that stick on the wall and nowhere else. People want to see values lived by their leaders. And the best place and time to see whether the leaders stick to those values is in the difficult times when there are difficult choices to be made. Do you choose the side of your values, or do you choose what is expedient? And a number of times we had to actually, I suppose, be courageous, right? And step out there and make decisions that actually upheld those values, but at the same time were challenging to the circumstance at the time. I know at least once where, when we were still in South Africa, one of our clients invited me to a meal and effectively wanted to solicit me to bribe him in exchange for business. And I had to turn down that business. I had to say, I'm sorry, we don't stand for that sort of thing. We just don't do it. At first I thought he was joking.
Yeah.
And then when I saw that, nope, he's serious when he was talking about brown paper bags and money, then I thought, no, I'm sorry, this is not what we do. So that's another example. One example is, which is not so sinister and serious, is excellence. A lot of people talk about excellence in business, right? So what do you do when you've made a mistake in your portfolio and it cost the client money? Right? And so we actually we were speaking to the client, and the client called us out, actually said, hey, you presented this, but that's what actually happened. There's a slight discrepancy there. And we looked, and lo and behold, this client was right. And the first thing, obviously, is to own the problem rather than blaming someone. Typically, when you're in that sort of professional situation, you want to blame someone for it. We owned it. We actually did the homework and realized, oh, wow, and we found out why. And then as the leader, you have to take ownership and say, right, this is my problem. I could blame that staff member or that staff member. This is my problem. How did this happen on my watch? And then we had to make the client good. And we actually said to the client, not only are we going to make you good, but we're not going to charge you fees for the month. And the client said, no, there's no need to do that. No, that's over the top. And we said, no, this is what we stand for. We say we're excellent. If this is a message to be communicated to everyone, it affects our profits, it affects our bonuses, it affects our increments. We need to actually take a knock here so everyone gets the message that this is what we stand for. We can't be sloppy when we're looking after our client money. And what we found is, do you know that at one stage we hadn't lost a single client relationship for 7 years? Now in the asset management industry, you have quarterly reviews. So you lose clients sometimes every quarter, every month. To not lose a client for a year is a good innings. To not lose a client for 7 years in a row is damn near incredible, almost impossible. And we were able to set those sort of records because everyone saw, oops, he really does mean it, and it's going to cost him, and it's going to cost each one of us if we don't adhere to our values.
Yeah. I love that extreme ownership is going to cost you in the short term, but it's really going to help you retain customers and serve customers over the long term. That's something that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned courage earlier, and I want to go back to key points where it was truly tested. Talk to me about the time when you transitioned from being an individual contributor in the finance world working for a company to then want to move on and start your own venture. What was that process like? And talk to us about the courage that was required to do that.
Well, what is very interesting is we're talking about the time when I was in my late 20s. I realized that I could learn a lot in the industry, and that it was probably best, way before I ever thought of launching my own business, to learn as much as possible before branching out. And I think that was valuable. But eventually you get to a stage where, and some of my buddies were saying, let's start this new venture. It was whilst I was in London, and a couple of my friends who had gone to the same church that I had gone to were saying, hey, and a lot of them are black and white South Africans. And the reason why this is a significant point is because apartheid had just ended in South Africa in 1994. And so these guys had said, you know what, let's actually go and start a business that's run and owned by blacks and whites for the first time ever. There were no real businesses that were like that in South Africa at that stage. And so they said, let's go and do this. And they were all from the sort of McKinsey competitor, I think their company was called the Monitor Company. So they were these management consultant types, real sort of gray matter, cerebral types. They wanted to go into management consulting. And I said, well, I'm an asset manager and an investment banker. That's what I do. At that stage, I was working for a company, one or two companies in the UK. And they said, well, you know what, why don't you come and start an asset management business with us? You'll be asset management and we'll be management consultancy. And I remember having the discussion with my wife. I yesterday just celebrated my 25th anniversary, and it wouldn't be being fair and true if I didn't give tribute to two people who are key to that bravery that I needed at that stage. And ultimately it was God, my belief that God puts us here on this planet for a reason, and each one of us need to fulfill that reason. And until we do, there's always going to be something missing. And then the second thing is my wife. I had to actually make sure that she was cool with it. Because she's going to have to be there, to pick up the pieces if things don't work out. But at the same time, she's also going to be there in the day-to-day. And we're a team. We've always had this vision of, as a married couple, being a team. So, you know, she was with it. I told her, hey, there might be times when the salary won't come in, you know, for that month. And you need to be good with that. Is that something you're good with? And I suppose if she had turned around and said, no, you know, she's not ready with it, I either would have had to delay it or maybe never take it up. And that's when you realize that you really are a team. Then from there, it was a matter of doing the research, the normal sort of business MBA type things that they tell you to do, which is to research a market, to research your unique value proposition that you believe you can bring. And at that stage, we believed that we had something to offer. At that stage, there were very few black CFA charter holders. The CFA charter is like, I suppose, the equivalent to investments as, say, a bar is to a lawyer, or housemanship or being resident is to a doctor. So there are very few of us who are people of color in South Africa that had that qualification for investments, the globally recognized one. And we thought, okay, so we had the skill and we were unique in that regard. But then when we started researching and we found giants such as Burton Markeel and John Bogle and various others internationally that were changing investments upside down, and by challenging it with cutting edge disruptive type approaches to investments, we thought, let's do that. And we then did that, and we grew within 7 years to where we were the largest of our kind in Africa in the passive asset management space, and went into various alliances, and the rest was history.
Yeah. So I love the fact that the diversity component was something that everybody understood and naturally made the partnership special, the company special. Tell me a little bit about what were some of the obstacles that you ran into starting a company that was diverse in South Africa, that was a mix of blacks and whites, that was trying to change the game?
I think the very first one was, it's very interesting. I was sitting in this town called Phalaborwa, which is in the sticks in South Africa. It's a mining town. And I had gone to visit a number of the trustees, and as much of the industry was at that stage, a lot of the decision makers were white South Africans. And this is, we're talking just towards the end of the 90s, early 2000s. And there was sitting around the table, and I was introducing my company. Hi, I'm Tendai from Umbono Fund Managers. Umbono means vision. That's the name. This is Zulu, in the language Zulu, and in the Xhosa language, which means vision. So I said, hey, I'm from Vision Asset Management, Umbono Fund Managers, and explained what we're doing, and about passive, and etc., being a black South African company. And one of them just blatantly asked me and said, well, hang on, there's been every single black asset manager that started before you has failed. And they started listing the names. What makes you think you're different? Why do you think you're going to succeed? And why should we even think about, giving you our business? And I went and elaborated, the elevator pitch and summarized it. And this guy laughed in my face. He laughed and said, honestly, do you think they're going to be different? And I remember sitting there, and he actually went red in the face with laughter. I remember thinking, this is difficult in that I'm going to have to confront people's prejudices, right? And prejudices are very powerful things until they're changed.
Yeah.
I think it was Nelson Mandela said, things are always impossible until they become possible, right? Yeah. So, it's always impossible until it's done. And so I think that was one of the first ones, was shaking off the prejudices that black people in South Africa couldn't do it. We couldn't run money. Even though a lot of us had worked for some renowned asset managers in London, New York, various other places that some of us have gone to, you still had to deal with that prejudice. That's a relatively easy prejudice to work off, because if you're just given the chance, you can actually prove yourself. But that's the problem, is will people even give you the chance to prove yourself? And so that was a real one, and I think that's where our value proposition helped, because we argued that don't worry about our performance, because our performance, our asset management performance, is the index. Because people say, you haven't got experience. How long has your firm been, running money? And the weird thing is, it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. You can't run money until someone trusts you with money. People aren't going to trust your money until you've run money. So it's a bit of that. And so it was easier for us to actually say, well, our performance is the index. And when we said that, people then said, okay, they began to subscribe to us. And I remember the very first client we had, the very first mandate we won, there was a big debate. It was literally split by racial lines on the board of trustees who were making the decision. And the decision was between an incumbent that had been around for decades and us, the new kids on the block who hadn't a single penny. If you'd given me $1 to manage, you'd have been my first client. And thankfully, after raging debates where the meeting went way over time, they fought for us and we got our first mandate. And from there, we were able to continue to prove ourselves. So I think the very first bit of business is probably the most difficult. And my message would be to stick through with it. I think the second big one was our own limitations and insecurities that we put in our mind. I remember realizing that the giants outside you are actually sometimes not as big as the giants inside you. So the fact of actually going out there and facing your fears and doing things you think are impossible was probably the second big thing for me and others to overcome, and thankfully we did. And then the third one is around the environment. I think we grew. We actually started growing really well, and we began to realize that South Africa, even though it's a very sophisticated market for its size, in Africa, at that stage, the total market capitalization of South Africa was 1% of the world's total market capitalization. And of that 1%, there were some strong philosophical issues that the industry had with passive asset managers that we were. So we began to realize we needed to become global. So that was the next thing, is when you hit the ceiling, to actually stand back and say, okay, I keep hitting the ceiling. Maybe it's because I'm in a small room. Maybe I need to get out of this room and get into a bigger room where there's a higher ceiling. And so, those are the three main challenges I can think of right now.
Which is what eventually led you to come to the US market. So you were operating in South Africa, you stayed there, and then you decided to take on the beast, right, which was the US market.
That's right.
So what did that mean for you personally and professionally to go through the decision of uprooting a business and a family from South Africa and moving to the United States?
I think that's my wife and I were just thinking the other day that, you know, we if you had told us, if we got into a time machine and gone back 12 years and said, hey, in a year's time, you're going to be sitting in Boston, having lived there for 11 years, they're soon to be living there for 11 years with a business run out of Boston, we would have laughed at you, because we always thought South Africa was our home base, and we thought the UK could have been sort of maybe the developed world equivalent of home for us as well, having been born in the UK. We never thought the US was really a place we could consider as home or grow into as a home, or even consider bridging South Africa and the US, which is now becoming part of our vision. And I think the big thing there was, again, to revisit your own prejudices, to revisit your own limitations you put on yourself, because we do put limitations on ourselves, and sometimes others put limitations on us, and we buy into them. Even if initially you might oppose them, you actually begin to buy into them, and before you know it, you're actually living as if what they said to you was true. And so it was a matter of thinking, we think we've got something to show the rest of the world as South Africans. We think there's something that we can actually bring to the market. And also, having been here, then I realized that the United States is this incredible country, which is a collection of the international community, almost like the most adventurous of people from all over the world, whether people are from Europe or descendants of people from Europe, whether they're Native Americans who've been here ever since human living ever began on this continent, whether they're Africans who were brought here forcibly or Africans who then later on came voluntarily, whether it's Asians who came here, people from all over the world. What's interesting is that it seems to have been this melting pot. When the US is operating at its best, it's this melting pot of different strengths that are complementary. And I think the best way you see this happening is in the US Olympic team, just in terms of just how dominant, for example, the US is in Olympics. And you'll see everybody from everywhere. You see people who are Eastern Europeans who are now naturalized Americans. You see Asians who are Americans, Africans who are Americans, mixed race people who are Americans, Europeans who are Americans. that's the power of this place. And I think when we got here, we then began to realize, we could actually carve out a place here. We could work here and build something that's a sustainable business here.
Yeah, that's certainly an advantage that the U.S. has that can often be twisted into a disadvantage, right? Because immigration can take a very pessimistic tone, a very dark tone. But I appreciate what you're saying, because it's an optimistic view of immigration, and that the U.S. is a magnet for talent, global talent, which is a great opportunity to be celebrated. So one of the things that is really central to your story is that you had this very big vision as to what you wanted to do and where you wanted to go, and you removed these mental limitations to be able to grow into a market like the U.S. I have to imagine that this put a significant amount of strain on your family. You know, you have 5 children, you're married, and I know that a lot of people struggle with that balance, or finding that balance between how much do you pursue your career and fully invest in that versus how much, what the impact is on your family. You've obviously chosen to put your family first, but talk to us a little bit about that mental analysis that you've had to do over the years.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that, you know, it's our 25th anniversary, and people joke and say, "How young were you when you got married?" And I say 2. Lies. So no, we got married early, and having started a business relatively early in the late 20s, you know, we quickly had to learn through trial and error how to balance, and balance is easier said than done. So often, in fact, it feels as though there's everything but balance. So one of the things that we had in our late 20s, I remember the time when my wife was pulling her hair out because she hardly saw her husband, and she's got these young kids, and, you know, kids need attention and all the rest of it. And from when we initially, you know, when we had our first 2 kids, who were both my daughters, Gail Agnes and Michal, and most of that time was in the UK. Michal ended up being born in the UK as I was. Gail Agnes was born in Cape Town. That was actually an easier time because I wasn't executive yet. I wasn't starting my own business. So I was able to be very present and be there as a father. And my wife was just recently started going through videos and seeing that there was a lot of me there. But once we started the business, it's a completely, as the English say, completely different kettle of fish, right? It was completely different. Where you're now, you know, you have to be there, and sometimes you're at work 10 o'clock, the buck stops there. If there's something you need to do and you work until midnight, or even in some extreme scenarios where you have to work an all-nighter or 2, you know, what do you do? And you've got a young family and you've got a young wife that's got expectations. So we had to discuss all of these and work them out. And sometimes it wasn't easy working out the balancing of all of these things. But what happened is we began to be more resilient by actually working them out. And I think also the fact that we were both, we had, you know, our Christianity, our belief in Jesus as our common rock.
Yeah.
That was actually, it made it much more straightforward. Not simple, but much more straightforward in terms of ironing out the kinks. Because we knew that we subscribed to the fact that divorce for us wasn't really an option. Cheating on each other wasn't an option. Physical abuse or any sort of abuse of each other was also, again, not an option. And so we were able to stop each other and stop ourselves from taking any one of those actions that sometimes are a human instinct, a more human instinct than one would believe, to stress or to pressure or all those sort of challenges around family. And so by the time we actually got to where we were leaving South Africa and coming to the States, this country, we had no friends, no family, and we had to go to this place called Boston, where the winter, I understand, even killed the Pilgrims, right? The first winters were so brutal that they killed tons of people. We're going to that place from our beautiful sunny South Africa. And that was a challenge. But again, the resilience that we began to build and that being built on the rock for us was absolutely key. And that's what helped us, is that ability to have the resilience and the solid foundation to be able to face whatever storm life may throw at us.
There's something that built into what you're saying about facing the pressures of building the business and managing your marriage, is that you actually let Gail into it, right? I see, whereas oftentimes when we're building a business, we can tend to put up walls that isolate ourselves, where we deal with challenges and problems come up and we want to keep everyone out, right? So how did you manage to bring her in, or what was your mental framework to say, I'm going to be open with her and I want her to be a part of this too, so that when I talk about the successes of the business, she's in it as much as I am?
I mean, there's a reason why Rambo's a movie, right? It's unrealistic.
Yeah.
It's actually a sort of fantasy of broken manhood, right? Where you get there on your own and you get to the top of Everest, but you're on your own. That has to be pathetically sad, right? Where you get victories that you can't celebrate with anybody. You don't have any sort of legacy that you can pass on if you don't have your own biological children. What about the next generation of younger people who are watching you? What about passing on the baton to them? If you get there pathetically alone as Rambo, as being the only guy standing, the last man standing, that's a very pathetic, a very sad, icon that all of us, including myself, actually looked forward to. It was only through, again, biblical instruction and actually learning and sort of reprioritizing, getting perspective, to realize that, no, actually, I think there's an African saying that says, if you want to get somewhere fast, go alone. If you want to go somewhere far, go with others. And the whole thing about human endeavor is that we aspire to do some really tough things. I was just listening the other day, whilst I was wheeling my things through the airport, at Boston Logan Airport, they have JFK talking about going to the moon. Yeah. And this was in the early 60s, saying that by the end of the 60s, they wanted to land a man on the moon and bring him back safely. It sounded like a pipe dream, right? Now that's an example of going far. There's no way you can do something like that as one man. It's absolutely impossible. It's a team effort, and it's not just a team effort, it's a generation of teams. There were scientists that actually had to hand over technology to other scientists that came and took over. And then those other scientists had to be succeeded by other scientists before they even could land the first person on the moon. So it's the same sort of thing that I think as a man, one of the best thing that we as men should take account of is that we, in our brokenness over the centuries and millennia, have somehow believed that we can do this without women. That we can do this with men of our tribe only. Yeah. And then even within our tribe, people who are members of my family only. And then even within our family, my favorite members of my family only. You can see how that's increasingly broken the more insular you get. And that the more we actually look out and say, well, actually, there are going to be some women who are more powerful than I am in this field. Mm-hmm. And I need to respect that. And in fact, I need to listen to her. And so I think what's happening now is that we're beginning to realize in this whole diversity, I suppose, that we're doing, is that by including people, we're in a way underlining something that's key to the United States' own character. The United States has this motto, E pluribus unum, which is a Latin motto meaning from many, one. Yeah. And that talks about diversity, right? Yeah. It's the United States President's motto, it's the United States Senate motto, and it initially was probably meant to signify the states, but also the diverse peoples that were coming at that stage to the United States. But now we really need it to mean that, not only for the United States, but for the world, that we actually need people from different backgrounds. We need everybody around the table, to actually sit around and carve up today's problems and work them out together, regardless of the gender, regardless of the race. Yeah. Regardless of the age.
It seems like so many people seem to celebrate the value of diversity, but yet there's a problem when it comes to actually operating in the midst of a diverse environment, because by nature you're gonna disagree. By nature you're gonna run into people that have different backgrounds and they come from a different belief system. And so you're gonna disagree, there's gonna be some headbutting, but yet we're also confronted with the challenge now that we seem to struggle with disagreement more and more. that disagreement is no longer allowed, that we seek tribalism. So you have a unique perspective into this, because you not only built a business in the finance world and navigated the tribalism there, you navigated literal tribalism in South Africa, right? In the separation that existed there. I'd love to hear your perspective on how you deal with people that you know fundamentally disagree with you.
So great, and I think I changed a lot of my perspective through listening to the perspectives of others who've gone before me, because I'm also a younger generation to someone, which is comforting, especially at my age. So I read some books of people who've actually gone out there academically and done the research. And I mentioned a book earlier on which talks about being the good to great book. And that's where they talk about the fact that the best companies, and the reason why they're called good to great, was they measured companies that had trundled along and their share price relative to, say, the NASDAQ or the S&P 500 had sort of trundled along going flat, and then all of a sudden there was a kink upwards, an exponential kink upwards of how they grew. And so what they then said is, well, let's go a few years before that kink, and what was going on then? What made that company turn from being good to great? And one of the hallmarks of that is being able to embrace difference of opinion. Being able to have an environment that's not run like a top-down autocratic structure, but a structure where you allow good ideas to bubble up. And they talk about the nature of that sort of leadership being what they call a level 5 leader. And that's where the level 5 leader, they actually even gave examples of where they looked at these leaders and they found that they were very different to a typical leader. And I won't spoil it for those that want to read it, but I will pull out one thing, which is the need in this world of increasing anxiety. I mean, we are so anxious we can't even disagree with each other without calling each other names. We need to actually be able to listen to someone who has a completely different point of view to you. And even though their ideas will make your skin crawl, the whole hallmark of democracy, right, is to be able to embrace that and find a common way forward, right? Businesses are not, any way excused from that. Businesses have to work out problems. And there are many ways to overcome problems, right? Good businesses, I remember Richard Branson used to say that his whole view of why he was so successful was that he said he looked around at businesses where the business was no longer focused on solving the problems of the customer. He looked for customers that had unresolved problems. So we have to resolve problems, and the problems are becoming more and more complicated. And that means we need, therefore, as many different perspectives to come up with solutions that are sustainable. And then we also need to be able to encourage environments where no matter how junior or senior you are in the organization, there's efficient communication of data. And now we've got an even more challenging thing. It's not just the flow of data, but the flow of good data. In other words, are we getting real facts or are we getting alternative facts? These are bringing all sorts of new complexities to business that need people to actually be able to listen to opinions that are different to the conventional status quo opinion. We can't, there's a saying that says, generals fight the last war, right? We can't be fighting the Second World War using First World War tactics. Having been South African, bringing a South African perspective, I was giving my kids one of those boring history updates about the Anglo-Boer War, which was actually arguably one of the first modern wars in the world. And it was when this great empire, the British Empire, actually were lost and was sent with their tails between their legs back to England, when the Afrikaans people in South Africa beat them for the first bit of the Anglo-Boer War. And the reason why the Afrikaans people were able to do it is because the British generals hadn't adapted from their red coats that they had used all over the world successfully, except in the United States, and tried to use the red coat strategies in Africa, where there's savanna and grass and hedges you can hide in. And so the Afrikaans people wore brown or khaki clothing that was camouflaged and practiced shooting, accurate shooting rather than battery shooting and others all at once, like the British. And just those two tactics of camouflage and accurate pinpoint shooting made a much, much smaller army, the Afrikaans army, beat the British, the Empire. And that's the power of strategy. That's the power of having a diverse opinion around challenges. And so we've been like that over and over again. I can give example after example of where it's really, really important to have the most updated strategies, different opinions on resolving today's problems.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think adapted to a business context, or to entrepreneurs out there who might be thinking of even starting their own business, people that might even be thinking of starting their own business. One of the challenges today, and you alluded to this earlier, is that there's so much noise out there, and you have to find yourself sorting through what's real and what's not, what's a reputable source, what's not. How do you continue to keep yourself updated and keep a pulse on what's going on? Who is the customer? What are the challenging issues? Like, what would you say is your approach to staying up to date, to staying relevant? We know that the news cycle can be exhausting, yet we need to pay attention to what is going on. And oftentimes people just choose to disconnect from what's going on altogether because they find it too overwhelming. What would you say to that?
So there was a wise gentleman who recently told me about a portion in the Bible that talks about not subscribing to the conspiracies that's almost put everybody in a spasm of fear.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things is, in order to be able to discern what is true and what is not, I think there has to be an audible, take a deep breath, take a few steps back and breathe.
Yeah.
And then look at the same analysis and ask yourself, okay, everybody around me is screaming and throwing fire and bashing into the walls and saying that, we're going to hell in a basket. Is this real? Is this really as scary as everyone is? And actually lean into the pain that everyone's running away from. And I think the thinkers who do that, who are actually able to take a step back, reanalyze the situation from a more objective, somewhat dispassionate point of view, taking full harness of their own passions that wants to trigger and get them into knee-jerk reactions. And then when you begin to confer with other people who are doing the same thing, you can begin to see the problem as the problem and not everybody else as the problem. And I'm told that that's one of the benefits of having a whiteboard in a meeting, is if everybody can then just focus on the whiteboard, then they can resolve the problem. But if you see the other person as the problem purely because they have a different perspective or a different point of view, or even an annoying perspective, let's talk about that. And even when you find someone's got an annoying perspective, I've started recently asking myself, well, hang on, why am I finding their perspective so annoying? Because that's got more to do with me than it actually has to do with them, right? They're just bringing a perspective. Why does their perspective annoy me? What is it triggering in me? And when I start to actually analyze myself, I began to realize that sometimes the reason is once bitten, twice shy, right? So there's a good reason why once bitten, twice shy is a good way to live your life. But there's also a reason where you might, what's the best word? Inaccurately associate what they're saying with your pain, when it's not actually a reason to feel pain for it all.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I appreciate about you is that you live such a busy life. You have 5 children, a wife, leading a company, and yet you've also gone through a journey these past few years with your fitness, to the point where you started running marathons. So a lot of people struggle with making time for exercise and taking care of yourself while managing a really, really agitated, busy life. So I'd love to just hear from you, your story, and how you managed to overcome that.
Yeah, my story is it's a long one in terms of years, but not a long one in terms of me telling you now, because when I started off, probably in my pre-teens, I was already a heavy kid. I was one of the chubbiest, fattest kids in the school. Running was a nightmare for me. I still remember the one time at cross country, coming in so late that people were already removing the bunting and driving off home before I'd even got to the finish line with my buddies who were also just as slow as I was. And again, what happens is life teaches you over and over again areas where you begin to develop fears and you begin to build walls around areas that you consider no-go areas. And one of those was my own fitness and my own health in terms of my weight. So I was always, in fact, my good days when I was obese. I think I was actually at one stage morbidly obese. I just thought there's no way, no matter what I tried all the diets, and that's where I really fully empathize and support people who may be struggling with their weight, is because it's just not fair. I mean, there's some people who can just chew donuts like as if it's going out of fashion and not put an ounce of fat. And I used to feel as I stared at a grain of rice and added 5 pounds. It just wasn't fair. And then all of a sudden, completely unexpectedly, in my late 30s, a good friend of mine's wife passed away, and he wanted us to all, he and his buddies, to do this Tough Mudder. And I was almost 300 pounds at that stage. And he turned on to me at his wife's funeral and said, would you like to run the Tough Mudder with me? And to this day, I don't know whether he was just being polite, because I was in no shape to run a Tough Mudder, which is like a half a marathon up and down ski mountains with 20 obstacles put together by the British Special Forces originally, blah, blah, blah. And so I just said, I nodded and said, yeah. And it's one of those, for 2 years, we'll turn around and say, hey, we should do this, hey, we should do this. And nothing happened. And then November 2013, he came to me and said, you know what, I found a coach, let's do this. I've got a whole lot of other dads, some who are 10 years older than me, and we got together. And that was a journey of self-discovery, because I realized that I had actually become overweight in my mind as well as in my body. So when I started, and the big thing for me was the diet, and I realized that carbs, sugars, and me, we just don't get on. I love sweet things. I love cakes, especially. And I realized I had to cut all of those out of my diet and take up what some people call the paleo diet, which has been a huge discovery for me. I also realized that my uncle, my dad's twin brother, passed away from diabetes. And a number of people I know who are African, or who are Native American or even Latino struggle with obesity and what you call diabetes. And the moment, and I was pre-diabetic myself, my doctor warned me that I was just an inch shy of being diabetic. And just cutting all of those out of my diet saved the day. I shed huge amounts of weight. I think at one stage it was 80 pounds of weight. Was able to run a couple of Tough Mudders, and then one very auspicious morning, I got up and I just really sensed that Father God was saying to me, what's the next challenge from a physical point of view? And I remember thinking, I'd really like to challenge myself to run a marathon. Even as I said it, I thought, that's ridiculous. Why would you try that? That's just so way out of your league. And I just got more and more sense that it was the challenge that the Lord was giving me. And so he left it up to me, and I prayed it through, discussed it with my family again, and took it up and ran the very first marathon, or should I say swam the first marathon in 2018, when the Boston Marathon had that deluge of water in 2018. And it was incredible. The training, and I think the best advice I got from anyone was that the marathon was a celebration of all the training. And anybody who's run the Boston Marathon and trained for it in Boston will tell you that running and dodging black ice and running in the snow and running in sub-freezing temperatures and rain and all the rest of it and wind, that is, by the time you run that marathon, you're thinking, man, I'm ready for this. Yes. And so having run that once and gone through the correct training and also getting a lot of input, and again, it wasn't all about me. I needed a chiropractor, I needed people who had run before who gave me tips on what to do. Gail, my wife, was a very good inspiration. Sometimes she's one of those people who sort of jab you in the ribs to get you going. So she was good. My kids, just the fact that they were shocked at Dad running this marathon. So in a way it became a family project and then a community project. And I was raising some money for some charities. and people were very generous in terms of backing me, and so all of those things all added up to eventually running this marathon and crossing that line. And it was emotional. It was a very emotional day.
Yeah. So you not only managed to get fit and lose all that weight and run the marathon, you've also managed to keep it off. And I think that's a struggle for a lot of people, not just losing weight, but keeping the weight off. How have you managed to keep the weight off throughout these years?
I think it's also by learning from looking at other people. There was this one lady, so when I did the paleo diet, I thought, okay, it's a diet. It's going to be maybe 3-4 months of pain and everything will be right. And that's the worst sort of mentality, because as you rightly say, you put it all back on again. Yeah. Because as I mentioned, that you're still in a way overweight in your mind. So I remember when I was way thinner, I would still sit very slowly on a chair because I had broken a number of chairs just by sitting on them. Yeah. Right? So in my mind, I was still nearly 300 pounds. And people would wonder, why is he sitting down so slowly? But it's because I got so used to that, yes, that I actually had to remember that, no, I'm not that heavy anymore. You can actually sit down at a normal speed. It's okay. So I'd sit down at a normal speed, and then I'll still be like waiting for the crack before and it didn't come. And yes. Oh, wait, what am I doing? It's not me anymore. So there's definitely a journey that one needs to do. And the person I learned from was a lady who I'd never thought struggled with weight. She always appeared to me as if she was someone who was so-called normal weight, and in fact on the thin side. And I learned that she lived her whole life not eating carbs and sugar. So I worked on something that worked for me, which was to only have my sweet tooth days and celebrations on family birthdays, yeah, and holidays. And even that, being human, meant that all of a sudden everybody's part of my family, right? Yeah. So I can have no family birthdays. Everybody's, every celebration, I'll celebrate all the holidays, and so, having to then learn that I needed to overcome it up here. Mm-hmm. So that was my journey, is learning from others, having had enough of being overweight and realizing that it could actually jeopardize my life, because people who are diabetic, it's a real weight to carry, and it can have an impact on your life expectancy. There's some who live a long time with diabetes, but it's a challenge. Right? Yeah. So I thought, if I can avoid that, then. And by the way, I actually have a buddy who was actually diabetic. He is recorded in the UK. He asked me how I'd lost weight, and when I explained how I did it, he's one of the few cases recorded in Scotland where he's gone from being fully diabetic to where he's no longer diabetic through eating correctly and cutting out sugar and carbs from his diet. So these sort of things are possible.
Yeah. There's two things that have come up that are connected. First of all, you talked about your mental limitations when you were starting a business with blacks and whites in South Africa, right? And there were certain limitations in your mind that naturally came up because of the constraints. And then there were natural limitations that came up in your mind in your fitness journey, right? And so as entrepreneurs or as people who have aspirations or have a goal, oftentimes a lot of our energy is being consumed with interacting with this negative self-talk, this internal negative narrative that is emphasizing or underscoring the limits, the mental limits that are in our minds. And so I'd love to hear your perspective on when the negative self-talk comes, when the mental limitations come up, what's your approach to dealing with that?
So, and I think one needs to deal with it this way, in terms of, there's a great sage, modern sage, her name is Brené Brown, and she talks about shame and the role that shame has. And the interesting thing I found is that most human beings struggle with shame. Mm-hmm. There's almost like an opposing force that tells every single human being, no matter who we are, that we're not worthy, we won't make it, we're a fraud, you have nothing to offer. And all of those are lies. And unfortunately what happens is, somewhere along all of our lives, we buy into those lies, right? That we've got nothing to offer, we're going to fail. My daughter just the other day was showing me a clip of Oprah in 1986, when she just started off in a talk show career. And you could see the interviewer, who was this American gentleman, a white gentleman, interviewing her. He was literally in fear for her, right? Because he thought, she doesn't know what she doesn't know, and she's going to be a failure. This was all in his body language if you watch this video. And the reality is that the sad thing is, this shame that all of us buy into is a lie. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think back to this story around the Jewish or the Israelite people in the desert, when they were just about to inherit the promised land, and they felt that they could not inherit this promised land because they were grasshoppers. Mm-hmm. They saw themselves as grasshoppers, and that the people guarding the land were giants, and that even the bunches of grapes were bigger than a man could carry, and all that sort of thing. And I think that's a good analogy. It's a very true verse and a very true story, but it's an analogy as well of modern life, that so often we stop ourselves having the permission to even try, right? Because we say, we're not big enough for this moment. Mm-hmm. We're going to lose because we don't deserve to go out there and succeed and win. And I wonder how many inventions, how many amazing stories have not been seen because the people who owned those inventions, those stories, denied the rest of us the opportunity of seeing that because of that lie, that they are too small and that everything outside of them are giants. And that's what I meant when I said right at the beginning of our conversation about the giants within. Sometimes the giants inside our own hearts are bigger than the giants we're perceiving to be out there, and that we've bought into the fact that we have nothing to offer and we just should sit down and keep quiet and not contribute. Mandela, I think, again, I'm quoting Mandela for the second time, not only did he say it's always impossible until it's done, which I think is a great saying, but he also said that who are you to take such a negative position of yourself, to make yourself small so that everybody around you feels comfortable. And I noticed that Miss Universe, 2 days ago, who's now Miss South Africa, talked about women taking their space. She said she wants women to take their space around the world. I strongly believe that God created men and women to take their space. And that's the point, is everybody feels they're doing everybody a service by being small and pretending to be small. So we all fit in and we all stay at the same level so that we aren't as big. And what Mandela said in his saying, just to continue the saying, is that by you standing up and shining as brightly as you can and being the truest that God had created you to be effectively, that you then give all of us permission to stand up and shine. When you stand up and shine, then you're actually giving all of us permission to stand up and shine. But when you sit cowering, we all lose out. So I think that's one of the things I've learned about, and I'm still learning about this, is when I feel like sitting down and keeping quiet, to stand up and talk. And not to ask people for permission to be what I was created to be.
I've found that there's a natural fear that comes when we're about to break the mold, when we're thinking about standing up and projecting our voice and pursuing what we feel called to pursue. There's a natural fear and trepidation because you're stepping out and doing something that nobody else is doing. And we've been so trained by society to conform and just to fall in line and fall into a pattern. What's your encouragement for people who are in that point in time when they are at a job or at a function in a role where it's safe, maybe it's comfortable, maybe they do get a paycheck, but they know deep down that they should be doing something else? What's your encouragement to them in overcoming that fear?
So I think the most frightening position to be in is where you need permission from everybody else to live your life. I think God has given everybody a conscience, and He's given us His word. And the most amazing thing is when you actually begin the first step on that journey of who you were created to be, your destiny. right? That first step on that journey of your destiny is so liberating that you'll realize how fearful and how in the nether glooms that life was of being scared to take that first step and just towing the line to fit in. Because again, it's this paradox. I realize that we can't avoid pain, right? Pain is an inevitability. It's just a matter of when and how you want that pain. Do you want the pain now, whilst you get stronger and whilst you build up the muscles to actually be able to tackle your problem more sustainably in the future? Or do you want the pain in the future when you've got so used to decadence and comfort that you actually can't face the pain when it comes? And those are the choices, it seems. Those seem to be the two choices and maybe permutations in the middle between those two extremes that we seem to have before us as humanity. Is, do we want to take the pain now in a way that we build up muscle and get stronger so we can face the future more strongly? Or do we want to have decadence and comfort now so that when that pain comes, we can't face it? And where we basically become victims of that pain. And sadly, more of us than we actually want to admit will choose the second. Because what happens is a decadence sort of pretends to be an anesthetic, and it's not an anesthetic, because when the pain comes, it's going to disappear. That decadence and comfort is not going to be there for the pain and the discomfort that comes in the future. And you can apply that to almost any human problem we've got right now, whether it's the environment, whether it's difficult choices we have to make in terms of accepting people who are different to us, whether it's whatever problem is, are we ready to go through the initial discomfort of challenging our paradigms today in order so that we can be more sustainable for the future, or are we going to continue to live the lives of the past and face a future where we're more victims than people who have any direction on what's going on?
So essentially pain avoidance is actually just punting. It's just putting it to the future, where you're not really avoiding it, you're postponing it in conditions that aren't going to be as favorable to you. I heard someone put it recently that discipline equals freedom, that the decision to do what's hard today, that you know must happen, is a decision to free yourself and to live a freer life.
Very much so, and I've experienced it. There've been, just even in the analogy of training for a marathon, there've been days when it is not fun. You get up and it's dark, it's grey, and there's just ice everywhere, and it's 15 degrees, and the warmth of your bed is luring you. Those sheets feel like some sort of sticky substance that will hold you to your bed. And I think just that little small victory of getting one leg out, and then the second, and then getting on the road, is a victory that is sweet. And practicing that every day, whatever area it is, start trading by getting small victories that come through postponing comfort and postponing decadence, and then life becomes more meaningful.
Awesome. Well, Tendai, thanks so much for joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you, man, Naz. Thank you. Pleasure being here, and thank you for the privilege of bespout my experience and my testimony of what's happened.
Our pleasure. Thank you very much.